Welcome back to the Van Jones Show. We continue to see examples of extreme right-wing violence in the U.S. and around the world. This week in California, a mosque was set on fire. Police are investigating that as a hate crime, and graffiti left at the scene referenced the horrific, deadly attacks on 2 mosques in New Zealand earlier this month. And just days ago, the U.S. Department of Justice says it busted a violent white supremacist gang in Alaska. 18 people were charged, several with gun trafficking, kidnapping, and even murder. The president is still having trouble saying that white nationalism is a growing threat, but his own FBI says that hate crimes are on the rise. So I recently spoke with a young man who has unique insight into the white nationalist movement. His father was a leader in the Ku Klux Klan, and his godfather is David Duke. But the experiences in college profoundly changed him, and he ended up denouncing and apologizing for his past views. Take a look at my interview with Derek Black. Look, man, it takes courage to change anything. To change your whole worldview takes a lot of courage. Help us understand, before we talk about that, why do you think all this is happening now? What is behind this appeal for white nationalism in America?
Coming from that background that I do, it's always been happening. It's always been, sometimes not on TV, but it's always been there. There's always been people who were saying the things you saw at Charlottesville. There's always been politicians who are saying the things that Donald Trump says now. They didn't get as much support, and I think we didn't pay as much attention to them as we probably should have.
Mm-hmm. You actually were able to run for office and win using some of these kind of dog whistles. What are the dog whistles that you found effective when you were part of this movement to mainstream ideas?
Yeah, I ran for this little committee seat, a Republican committee seat in South Florida, right across the water from Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump's house down there. So he's always been in my life. And I went door to door, and I said stuff like, don't you think the signs in Spanish are, kind of undermining your culture? I said, like, don't you think that people of color who live in that other neighborhood, don't you think there needs to be more police for people like that? Like, these kind of messages, really similar stuff to what Trump said on the campaign trail. Mm-hmm. And people would react to it as long as they didn't hear the word racist, as long as they didn't hear, I'm a white nationalist, as long as you didn't say that sort of stuff. These are things that they viscerally reacted to, and that was what the white nationalist movement was saying. I would just try to figure out ways to say it that didn't freak them out so much.
And you were able to get just normal, regular people who would never say, I'm a white nationalist, to resonate with you and vote for you.
No, I got, I think, 62% of the vote saying that stuff.
Yeah.
It was a small election, but I was trying to demonstrate in 2008, a couple of months before Barack Obama won the presidential election, I was trying to demonstrate that these kind of talking points were effective.
Mm-hmm. What were some of the things that you were raised to believe as a child growing up in a KKK sort of a family?
Yeah, my family pioneered taking white nationalism mainstream. Like my dad and David Duke were friends from the times they were teenagers in the 60s, and they worked together the whole time. And when David Duke ran his campaigns and was successful in Louisiana in the late 80s and the 90s, my dad was helping run the campaign. And then after that, my dad started the first white nationalist website and took white supremacy online.
Stormfront.
Yeah, Stormfront, and created the largest community for decades. And so I grew up with this community around me and the leadership and the people who were running the organizations, who all had a belief that white nationalism was only marginalized because people didn't want to be called racist. And if they could get over that, if they could say stuff, if they could sanitize it just enough, then they could win elections. And they always believed that if they could just get the right message and the right person, that people would respond.
But you as a child, what were you being taught?
The beliefs of white nationalism is that race is absolutely scientifically real, and that it predicts all this stuff about people, like black people commit crime and white people are smart, and all this like stupid stuff that they back up with fake science.
I want people to understand, for you to make the change that you made is a big deal because, again, you ran for office, you had a child's version of Stormfront, you had a radio show. I mean, you were going hard. Some of the ideas that were being espoused, like ending birthright citizenship, prioritizing European immigrants over everybody else, building a wall, calling minorities criminals. That stuff is now coming from the very top. How does it feel to hear ideas that you and your family helped to develop suddenly now being broadcast from the very top of our society?
It's terrible, right? After I renounced it, I renounced 5 or 6 years ago, and I spent about 3 years thinking I would never have to talk about it again because obviously people understood that racist ideas needed to be pushed back and we needed to move forward and that we were moving forward. And I realized basically in 2015 with the presidential election that that was so naive and that the ideas that white nationalism, that my family, that I had pushed forward, had created ways of talking about it, they got a lot of traction.
Yeah.
They could get a lot of traction, and I started seeing tweets by the president that used the same phrasing that I had figured out how to use online in the early 2000s, and thinking about that I could put out ideas, that we as a white nationalist community could put out ideas. And even if I renounced it, you don't take the ideas back. They still bounce around. They still get picked up. People still...
How'd that make you feel?
It's terrible. There are things that continue to happen in America that I feel a little bit responsible for, and I don't know exactly how much, and I don't know exactly where to place, the blame and what to do about it, and I just try to push back against racist ideas as much as I can now, but it never feels like I've balanced a scale.
Yeah. Is Donald Trump a white nationalist, as best you can tell?
He's not a white nationalist in the sense that I think we should reserve that term to talk about that actual movement. The people at Charlottesville were white nationalists. They're deeply anti-Semitic. They believe that there's a Jewish conspiracy. The shooter at the synagogue in Pittsburgh was a white nationalist. He was reading white nationalist stuff. And Donald Trump is not that.
Mm-hmm. What would you call Donald Trump? How do you see Donald Trump?
Donald Trump is a person who is at times buying into and at times, I think, opportunistically using the fact that white supremacy is the legacy of America, and it's naive of us to think that it's gone. Mm-hmm. We all carry around these sort of ideas about wealth inequality being okay when it's so imbalanced from white people and people of color, or that incarceration affecting people of color, that's just how it happened. Like, thinking that that's just normal America is buying into a white supremacist legacy. And we get really uncomfortable talking about that, and Donald Trump, at the base level, is capitalizing on that.